Hey, health junkies! It's time for The Health Fix. Join your host, Dr. Janine Krause, as she gives you a dose of what you need to know and do right now to take control of your health from the inside out, to rebel against aging, look damn good, fight stress, and laugh every day.
Hello, health junkies. Welcome to another episode of The Health Fix. Today, we're going to be talking all about your mitochondria. These are your factories that you have in every single one of your cells. And what they do is they provide you with energy, but they also are taking in your nutrients. So everything you eat that gets broken down in your digestive system eventually makes its way to each and every one of your cells and the mitochondria, the factories within those cells. So the cool thing here is that these little factories are just working all the time to keep us nice and energized. The bad thing is that unfortunately a lot of us, because of our lifestyles, what we eat, how hard we push ourselves, how well we are at resting and giving ourselves proper nutrition after workouts, that is the factor in which keeps these mitochondria healthy or not. And in my practice, I'm starting to notice as my patients get older and my patient population turns a little bit more towards folks who are higher end athletes and folks who are working out at the gym and wanting to really keep themselves just fit until they're like 112. And what I'm seeing is that we've got a lot of folks who are super fit, but really fatigued. And I have a lot of folks who can lift a ton of weight, who do amazing in the Olympic weightlifting universe and the CrossFit world, but they're struggling with their weight, they're struggling with energy levels, they're struggling with recovery of their muscle tissue. And what I tend to see is we've got females who can't lose weight. We've got guys who I get my hands on their tissue when I'm working on their muscles to release tension, and their tissue just feels like beef jerky. It's just dried out. It's all sticky. And not to say that's all guys. I do have some ladies too that I'm like, whoa, your tissue feels dehydrated. It's almost like mummy-like. And I say mummy-like because I've had a lot of experience working in cadaver labs studying anatomy, and it's almost like their tissue feels much like a dead person's tissue. It's gross. And what that means is that those mitochondria are not adequately getting their nutrients, and they're not adequately turning over energy, and they're not keeping the cells healthy. So in the fancy medical term, this is something called mitochondrial fatigue. Mitochondria being your little factories in every single cell, and fatigue being they're pooped out. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, how do I poop out my mitochondria? Shouldn't they just work? They're part of the body. Well, unfortunately, there's a lot of different things that we do that trash our mitochondria. In particular, there's certain things that we can control, and there are things that we can't. But in particular, the big thing that we can control is what we're eating. Now, if you've listened to any of my other podcasts, you'll notice a theme. I do talk about clean eating and not eating junk food and things of that nature. And it might sound like I'm so perfect and I never eat junk food. So not true. I love potato chips. Like, I can't tell you about how much I love them. They're like, oh my God, I don't even know where to begin. And here in Tacoma, Washington, where I live, there's a place that makes their own potato chips. I don't even want to know what oil they use. I don't even want to know how it's done. They're just delicious. And I absolutely love them. But every time I eat them, I tend to feel like crap for a couple days after, and I'm going, was it worth it? Well, when I start to think about it, there's two things that happen. Think about it for a moment about that favorite food, that junk food that you love. You just can't get enough of it, right? What's that one, you can't eat enough of the J's, or you can't just eat one? Lay's, J's, I don't know what potato chip company it is. But the point being is that usually with junk food, you can't seem to get just one of them, and you can't seem to say no, and you just keep going. And what you're doing is you're overloading your digestive system first, and then you've got a whole dump of molecules going into the bloodstream that's going to hit those mitochondria. And the point of me mentioning my obsession with potato chips and going through this is that most Americans tend to overeat. And the problem here is that Yes, we overeat on chips and junk food that we love, but sometimes we also overeat on healthy foods. And that too can go drastically wrong. I know a lot of patients that are struggling to lose weight and they go nuts on eating a whole bunch of, let's say, sweet potatoes, like baked sweet potatoes. They go nuts on eating a ton of salads and things of that nature. And unfortunately, anything in excess is also going to overload our mitochondria. And the way this excess food consumption does that is our digestive system gets the food, it's got to deal with it, then it's going to break it down, and then we're going to get a bunch of molecules going into the bloodstream and hitting our cells. And what happens is when we've got all of this abundance of nutrients going to the mitochondria, they get overwhelmed. It's much like a conveyor belt. You put a whole bunch of stuff on the conveyor belt, well, the conveyor belt's eventually going to run out of space. And in terms of your mitochondria, they have receptors and they bring things in. And in particular, things are brought into the cell first, then transferred into the mitochondria. And let's give a good example back to my potato chips. Potato chips are carbohydrates. Carbohydrates will raise your blood sugar, meaning raise your glucose. Well, when we have higher blood sugar, aka higher glucose in our bloodstream, we are going to be taking those glucose molecules and trying to get them into our cells. And the way we get glucose into our cells is we use a molecule called insulin. And insulin goes up and grabs the glucose and binds to a cell and sucks the glucose into a cell. Now, if you are constantly giving your body too much of a carbohydrate, well, guess what happens? Your cells get sick of seeing insulin. It's like listening to the same song on the radio too much. You get sick of it. And what happens is that your cells stop responding to insulin. They're like, yeah, whatever. Maybe later. Maybe I'll listen to that song later. And unfortunately, our blood sugar stays high. That causes issues. That's a big problem because the longer the blood sugar remains elevated in the body, the more we have ability to store those glucose molecules as fat, but also we have issues in terms of nerve damage and other things of that nature, such as damage to the walls of the arteries, because those glucose molecules can rip the sides of our arteries, causing irritation. And then what happens is our body has to release platelets to go and plug up those irritations. So we get an inflammatory reaction. We could have all kinds of negative side effects from that. There's quite a cascade that goes along with that. So that being said, this abundance of molecules can cause some serious issues for our mitochondria. Now, increased carbohydrates is one thing, and with all the fad diets out there of low carb, keto, etc., yeah, you would think that carbs are always the devil. It's not always carbs. You can overdo it on fats. You can overdo it on proteins. And that too can become a problem. And eating too much of any molecule, whether it's fat, carbohydrate, or protein, will cause damage to our mitochondria because they're going to get overloaded. Their conveyor belts are not going to be able to bring in all those nutrients and spit out energy for us because they take in protein, carb, and fat and make energy. So the idea of being overfed and undernourished and fatigued is really a true concept this day and age because a lot of us have suffered with portion distortion for a long time, myself included. I mean, if something tastes good, it is freaking hard to stop eating that thing. And believe me, food scientists with the processed foods, they know exactly how to trick you into eating more of a particular item. If you see a label that has natural flavors, my goodness, those natural flavors, you never know what's in there. They're chemicals, and a lot of them are researched to help you to basically hijack your brain and tell your brain you need more. Sounds insane and kind of like a conspiracy theory here, but it definitely does happen. And I know I talk about that in previous podcasts, and I'm not going to go into it with this one. So, getting back to this mitochondrial function thing here. If we can't make energy, we become extremely fatigued over time. I have a lot of patients that feel that they're aging so fast and they're just tired and they can't keep up at the gym. They can't keep up with their kids. They're not able to lift the amount of weights they want to. They're not recovering from workouts like they used to. And they keep saying, oh, I'm just getting old. I guess that's just the way it's going to be. Heck no, that's not the way it's going to be. I don't want to hear anyone say that. No, there's something wrong with your energy output and it needs to be fixed. And one of the best ways to assess what's going on with your mitochondria, your little factories and all of your cells, is to do a urine and a blood test. In this combination of the two, I use a company called the NutraEval by a company called Genova. And it essentially tells you how is your body taking in your carbohydrate, your fats, and your proteins, and what is it doing with it. In particular, it assesses a cycle called the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle. Now, any of you who have studied science or biology, remember this. And any of you who maybe remember this and were traumatized by having to memorize every step of it in high school biology, yes, this is the cycle that happens in your mitochondria for you to create energy. And in particular, what it's doing is we are taking in carbohydrates, proteins, and fats and turning them into energy throughout the cycle. In particular, the cycle is fueled mostly by something called pyruvic acid. And to get to this, and I'm not going to geek out too bad on science for you here, I need a demo and a video to show you all that, because let's face it, most of us do need visuals for that. But the point being here is this test tells you if you're breaking down these molecules and getting them into your system. It also tells you, are you muscle wasting? Are you not absorbing fats? What about fatty acid metabolism? So are you able to take the omega-3s that you are downing in your fish oil and utilize them for helping to heal cells? Are you able to take your omega-9s that you're getting from your olive oil and utilizing them in the body? Also, it also tells a lot about protein and protein breakdown. I have a lot of people in the workout universe, in which I love to hang out in, who are taking tons of protein powders in and they're not absorbing the protein and they're actually muscle wasting. So unfortunately, they're taking a bunch of protein in, but their muscles are still eating themselves. Not cool. That's in fact horrible, a lot of waste of money, but also waste of energy. So a big thing here is assessing where your body's at. And looking at your red blood cell analysis, and that comes in with this NutraEval, you can also tell all of the vitamins and minerals that you need to carry out the energy production that happens in the mitochondria. We need magnesium, we need iron, we need vitamins B3, vitamin B2, B6. These are critical vitamins, B5. I could go on forever. I pretty much can tell you that all of your B vitamins have some sort of component of a factor in your mitochondrial energy production factory. So this NutraEval assesses all of that. It also looks at dysbiosis. So by that I mean, do you have overgrowth of funguses? So yeast, things of that nature. Do you have an overgrowth of bacteria that's not benefiting you? There are some distinct research studies that show that certain amounts of certain species, or I could say, of bacteria help to keep you thin and help to promote balance within the body. And then there are others who promote damage within the body, meaning some will keep your blood sugar elevated, will mess with your digestion. And in particular, one of the best ways to go about this, to know what's going on, is to assess via the NutraEval, because we can look at metabolites that these bugs produce in your urine and determine, whoa, what's going on here? It's called an organic acids test, by the way, if you're wondering. The NutraEval is just the, quote, brand name for Genova. There's another company called Great Plains Laboratory, and they have something called the oat organic acid testing, and that's another way to get a hold of this type of testing. The difference between the organic acids testing and stool testing to know what kind of bacteria are in your gut is that the organic acids are looking at your small intestine and large intestine, so your body as a whole, whereas your stool testing is looking specifically just at your large intestine. Plus, your stool testing will be able to give you all the details as to what bugs are in your gut, whereas the NutriEval or organic acids testing is going to be looking a little different in that case and really give you the sense of, in broad spectrum, do you have issues with gut bacteria? Do you have issues with leaky gut? Things of that nature. Now, one of the big things that's absolutely key here for determining if you have mitochondrial fatigue is to get some testing. And the reason I highly recommend this, just like I had mentioned about the NutriEval and the organic acids testing, is that otherwise we're kind of guessing as to what B vitamins you might be lacking on and what type of digestion issues you have. Now, I have had patients who don't have the right insurance to cover these tests or don't want to pay for them, and what they do instead is we do kind of stab in the dark a little bit. And essentially, one of the best ways to work with your mitochondria is to make sure that you're digesting your foods properly, you're not overeating, you're taking a probiotic, and you're really working to balance your gut bacteria. And so you might be saying, okay, well, if I take a probiotic, how do I know I'm balancing my gut bacteria? Well, the answer is you really don't. And one of the best ways to actually balance your gut bacteria is to fast. And that sounds kind of crazy because I know it's a trend right now for intermittent fasting. So whether it's eating between a 6 and 8 hour window, and then that means you've got a 14 to 16 hour fast each day, or you're fasting 2 days a week. Those types of things are actually beneficial. And while I'm not a huge proponent for folks to get into a habit of doing this all the time, I actually love to have folks fast 3 days a week. 3 days a week. That sounds crazy. Never mind, not 3 days a week, 3 days a month. And I actually am going to follow up with my next podcast after this about fasting. So I'm not going to go into it a ton, but the key component here is if you don't put any food in the gut for 3 days, it actually helps for the body to reset the gut bacteria. It also resets insulin resistance. By that, I mean I can drop people's blood sugars, keep them off of diabetic medications such as metformin, things of that nature. It's awesome. And I will go into that in my next podcast right after this one. So stay tuned if you're really excited about that one. It's coming up in my next one. But it is important to think about not overloading your gut, maybe giving it a little bit of a rest. I have found that in folks who have a slow metabolism, as they might call it, or they're really fatigued and they can't seem to lose weight, if we get these folks to eat portions of food that are not overloading their gut and give themselves at least a 12 to 16 hour window. And yes, I'm changing my numbers from what I said before about 14 to 16, and give me a minute here, I'll explain that. But at least if we can get a 12-hour window between foods, that gives the mitochondria time to ease up that conveyor belt of nutrients coming in. So by that, I mean if we're not overloading our little factories with too many products going on the conveyor belt, we can actually get them to be more efficient. And by that, I mean we're not wearing out our little factories. We're actually letting them catch up on their work. So that's why I am a huge proponent of a little bit of fasting, and we'll talk about that in my next podcast. Now, in the assessment of your mitochondria, another big component is looking at genetic testing. And the reason that I recommend this is that it also gives us a sense of what does your body like for fuel based on your genetics. Now, is it the hard and fast, like, oh my gosh, you have to, like a strict rule, you have your genetics and this is what it says your body should do? Well, it gives you a really good sense, let's put it that way, of what your body likes. And taking that into account with the status that your body's at based on these tests, you can come up with a really great plan for targeting your mitochondria and making sure they stay healthy. Because unfortunately, all too often, I've got folks who are, they're following the fad diets. And As much as these fad diets are helpful, there are some really big downfalls to them because, yes, the mitochondria love to use fat for fuel. Using carbohydrates predominantly for fuel takes a lot of work, and it also is not as efficient. Using fat for fuel is more efficient. However, the problem becomes is that some of our bodies have a limit to which how much fat they can take. And when that means how much fat we can take, that's how much fat your mitochondria can take on its conveyor belts each day, each hour, etc. And so these are important factors because a lot of these diets out here are going keto's the only way to go, or this is the only way to go, that's the only way to go. And yes, they work in short time periods, but knowing your body and what it is really programmed genetically to tolerate is key. And the fact that we have this information at our fingertips now with some simple saliva testing is huge. So I highly recommend, if you're interested in really dialing in your mitochondria, that you consider some genetic testing. I look at Pathway Genomics for this. It's a great company. I like the Pathway Fit in particular for knowing what types of exercise and what type of food you should be eating. Now, that being said, one little thing I want to mention here is about the blood sugar. Now, a lot of us have been hearing a ton about carbs are bad, carbs are evil. The only reason they're technically evil is that they require more energy we require more of them to get energy out of them. So we need more carbohydrates to get more energy versus we need less fat to get energy out of fat. The other side of carbohydrates is that in the process of using them to make energy, we create a lot of what I call cellular poop. And that is a lot of reactive oxygen species. These are essentially free radicals, if you've heard of that term. And it's just cellular poop. It's just what happens naturally in the process of breaking down these molecules and creating energy. Whereas with fat, we don't get as many of those. And so the more reactive oxygen species, the more cellular byproduct poop we get, the more we have to clean it up. And so our body can become more toxic faster if we have too many carbohydrates in the mix. Now, of course, combine that with junk food carbohydrates and you've got a whole nother issue here. And I am not hating on carbohydrates. Please don't get that idea. It's just really keeping in check how many and what types you're eating. Because obviously ones closest to nature are much better than things like Laffy Taffy and, marshmallows. So now you're going to argue because marshmallows have some protein. Yeah, well, there you go. There's a lot of sugar that outweighs the protein in a marshmallow. So let's move on. So we've got some key components here about mitochondria. They definitely, if you give them a break from having food or you give them a break from having carbohydrates, they definitely will switch to being fat burners. And they can really help, like I said, with making you less insulin resistant. Now remember, insulin's what grabs glucose and brings it into cells for energy. And if our cells get so freaking used to seeing so much glucose, they are like, yep, heard that song on the radio 15 minutes ago. Don't want to pull that in. And that happens. And it happens to all of us at certain levels. Doesn't matter who you are, how old you are. It's if you keep pumping in carbohydrates, that happens. So the cool thing here is that if you have diabetes, if you are pre-diabetic, working on your mitochondria can help to reverse that. I'm going to tell you a little story. I have a patient right now. I actually just saw him 2 Fridays ago. And he came into my office with some labs from another doctor. And he had a blood sugar of 252. That was fasting. A normal blood sugar, honestly, for my tight parameters is between 80 and 90. And that's fasting. Yes, it could be, okay, so let's fudge a little. I like to see it somewhere between probably 70 and 90 as being okay. Once we get towards 90, I'm a little bit like, it's getting up there. Perfect blood sugar, 80 on the dot. That's how I like it. You can argue with me if you want, but I like it there. And if we have folks with 282, that's a big problem. You're diagnosed with diabetes when your blood sugar is at 126 more than one time on a fasting blood sugar. So that's a problem. He had a hemoglobin A1C of 11. That's ridiculous. A normal hemoglobin A1C should be right around 5. I personally like 4.5, somewhere in that range. 5.7 and above is prediabetes. That is an issue. And when I see that coming up for my patients, I'm going, okay, we got to fix their mitochondria. The other big thing with this fellow is that he had a thyroid stimulating hormone. So this is the hormone that comes from your comes from your brain, the pituitary gland, and stimulates your thyroid. It should be somewhere around 2. At 25, that means their thyroid is slow, hypothyroidism. So right there, if we've got blood sugar issues and we've got slow thyroid, warning bells are going off that the mitochondria are totally trashed. And so this guy, I had to get his thyroid in check first because I had to give some medication because that's way too high of a thyroid stimulating hormone. He's way too hypothyroid for him to be functioning without some medication. But the blood sugar, now a traditional doc, and probably anyone who's listening to this is going to go, oh my gosh, I would have put that person on medication right away. And yes, I cringe sometimes when I don't do it, but I had a hunch just talking to this guy and knowing what his diet was like that he was eating too many carbs. And he was just a lot of junk food, a lot of chips, a lot of just junk. His mitochondria were trashed. So on a hunch, I said, all right, let's try a little fast and let's see if we can reset him and really reset those mitochondria. And in 2 days after seeing me, I literally had him do some fasting, and I didn't, say, okay, don't eat for 3 days. What I had him do was eat between 8 hours throughout the day. So he started eating at 8 and he was done by 4. And in that time frame, he couldn't, he could eat regular portions. We talked about going very, lower carb. I did cut down his carbs on him. And believe it or not, in those 2 days, we got his blood sugar down to 90 and from 252. I had him testing, and he was testing 3 times a day. And the first day, things were around the high 100s. So he was at like 170, 180. And then by the second day, it was down in the 90s. And now he's in the 80s. And it's the fasting thing. And I've done this over and over again with a lot of my patients. I've done it with myself. And anything I say in here about experimentation with patients, believe me, I will do a lot of research. Please don't think I'm just doing this off the cuff. And I try everything on myself first to see what happens. I do have a tendency towards blood sugar issues with insulin insensitivity. I have noted in previous podcasts that my body likes carbohydrates genetically, but boy, I can't mess around with too much sugary stuff. It messes with me. And that means that my mitochondria are sensitive. And a lot of folks who are driven folks who burn the midnight oil, who are, working 3 jobs, pushing themselves to the limits, folks like that, you're going to burn your mitochondria out. Same thing if you're lifting a ton of weights and you're running, you're doing 2 a days, working out, things of that nature. You're just making it easier for you to burn your mitochondria out because you're pushing the amount of energy that those mitochondria need to produce for you to keep up your lifestyle. So that being said, going back to my patient, he's got his blood sugar in check now. We didn't have to use medication. Now, is this the case with every single one of my patients? Absolutely not. There are folks that I will do this test on them for a couple of days, and if we can't get that blood sugar down, I'm going to work on things. Maybe I'll give them Chinese herbs, or maybe I will go towards metformin or something of that nature in terms of medication. But it's just something that I really want folks out there to know, that you might be walking around right now, just like my patient, with elevated blood sugar on a given basis, and it might spike, say, after breakfast if you had like a bagel and maybe you put a little cream cheese on it, or it might be spiking if you're eating a cereal for breakfast. Captain Crunch, you know who you are. Quick cereals, hiding that stuff. I love Captain Crunch, man. That's one of the good ones. Cinnamon Toast Crunch too, by the way. But those suckers, boy, if you're eating those for breakfast and then you're noticing at like 10 o'clock in the morning, you're like about to crash. Well, you're pushing your blood sugar up and it's dropping. You're getting a big drop. And that's real hard on your mitochondria, your factories in the cells. Or if you're a type of person that's crashing around 2, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it could also be some blood sugar stuff, especially after lunch. And so if you have some insulin insensitivity, especially if you're a type of person that does a shake in the morning, you get protein powder in there and you've got a whole bunch of fruit in there, bananas, berries, etc., and you're thinking you're all healthy, you can boost too much of that blood sugar with that. Or if you're juicing, whole nother thing. I'm not going to get on that tangent, but juicing put some veggies in that stuff, please. Because if it's all fruit, you're going to spike your blood sugar and mess with your mitochondria too, especially if you're trying to keep running and pushing it and you're working a ton. So keep that in mind. So that being said, going back to these mitochondria, these guys are extremely sensitive to B vitamins, and they help the mitochondria to burn energy or produce energy so we can burn that energy. But the problem is that a lot of us overdo it on the B vitamins and confuse the mitochondria. And that's why I do recommend testing to know where you're deficient. And in a lot of cases, folks are putting a lot of B12, maybe getting B12 shots, or they're putting a lot of B6 into their body, but they're not thinking about vitamin B2 and B3, which are some of the key cofactors. And by cofactors, I mean kind of key helpers in terms of creating energy for us. So something to think about in that department. So another big thing here that is really popular these days are these medical fasts, where we're giving folks shakes and they're drinking the shakes and they are working to bring their glucose in check and they're working to lose weight and things of that nature. I've got a lot of folks that are in these categories that do really well, and it's because we're not overloading the system with a ton of food. That's why medical fasts work. Do I believe in all of them? No, because there's some out there that have some really crappy protein. Just saying, it's just not quality stuff. And then I've got folks that have issues with that. So do your research if you're considering a medical fast for your mitochondria. But for those of you who are just an everyday person going, boy, I do not want to age too fast. I don't want to see myself go downhill. I'm starting to notice I'm getting fatigued. I'm starting to notice that I can't lift weights like I used to. Absolutely critical to get an assessment of what's happening metabolically in your body. And it's even good to consider getting one for a baseline, because then you can retest later on once you've worked to correct things. Because knowing the health of your mitochondria can help you to literally extend your life. And by that I mean your mitochondria are key in your cells for keeping you energized. If you become fatigued because they're not working properly, now we've got issues, because you're not going to move as much. You're going to become more sedentary, and then now we're going to end up with gaining weight. We're going to have issues with joints and muscles. The other side of this is if the mitochondria are damaged, we also have difficulty healing our body. And that's a huge problem, because if we are building up a lot of the cellular poop, if you remember me mentioning that before, these free radicals, if we're building up a lot of those, now we're going to have more cellular damage. We're going to have more issues within that cell, and we're going to have some problems with being able to heal and recover from workouts. We're going to have problems with our brain function, because our nerve cells going to our brain, our neurons are not going to be able to heal themselves. And so it's a huge deal. And I want to be sharp in my mind until I'm 115. And for a lot of folks, mental decline, now we've got a lot of independence issues, things of that nature. So something to keep in mind there too, but also to keep in mind in terms of your skin, wrinkles, things of that nature. That has a lot to do with your cellular metabolism, the mitochondria as well. Also, a huge connection between your mitochondrial health and chronic disease, diabetes, heart disease. Those are big ones. Also cancer. And it's huge to keep in mind that if you can keep your cells healthy and energetic, you can keep them strong enough to fight off disease. One of our biggest issues we have in the US right now is that we've got, or not just in the US, in the world, we've got all of these superbugs that are taking over folks, and we're fatigued because we're burning the midnight oil, we're pushing ourselves to the limits, we're trying to get in all of these different tasks in a day, and we're stressing ourselves out and really putting a big demand on these mitochondria. That combined with a lot of environmental toxins that weigh us down, we've got a huge issue here. And keeping your mitochondria healthy is really one of the keys to keeping your body disease-free and sharp and lean as you age. And I highly, highly recommend that you get an assessment of this. Even if you're in your 30s, it's important to kind of get a jump on this. A lot of us don't think about it till we're in our 40s or 50s when the body starts to wear out even more. But honestly, getting a jump on it is huge. And I highly recommend folks to take a look into the Nutri-Eval by Genova, or an organic acids test by Great Plains Laboratory. Now, there are other laboratories that do those. I just happen to be familiar with those two, and I have a link in the resources portion of this episode in the show notes. So take a look at those. Now, I've also added in 2 components here, because every one of my podcasts, I like to give some advice as to, okay, if you think that you might have some mitochondrial fatigue, what can you do? Well, some of the quick, quote, non-laboratory tests that I do for folks to see if the mitochondria might be trashed and it might be the cause of why you have high blood sugar. So fasting blood glucose is elevated, or you've got a high hemoglobin A1C. I typically will have folks do a medical fast, something called Metabolic by Thorne. It is a formula of protein that's a vegan protein powder that is specifically for helping to get your mitochondria nice and healthy. It has all the molecules to nourish your mitochondria. And in fact, I actually recommend anyone who's even younger, into their 30s, late 20s, who's, been working a lot, eating a bunch of junk food because it's convenient, and pushing themselves in the gym, and, just really someone who's been driven and pushing themselves a lot and starting to feel fatigued chronically. Put yourself through a metabolic fast and eat between 8 hours throughout the day, whether it's 8 to 4 or whatever it might be. Do that for a couple of months and do the metabolic with it and see how you feel. I think it can make a huge difference for you, and something to consider. I've got a link to that. The other thing that I also recommend is something called Niacel. It's a derivative of niacin, which is vitamin B3. It's not going to give you a flush like niacin, regular niacin might. And what it does is it helps to enhance the function of your mitochondria. And I've used this a lot for some of my athletes and some of my higher end folks here, but I've also used it for weekend warriors and for those of you that really like to work on weightlifting and pushing yourselves to the limit. And the Niacel is amazing for helping with energy, and especially helping to get those mitochondria to recover after we put a high demand on them for energy when we push ourselves to the limit in the gym and the certain sports that we participate in. And so huge things to just take a look at and see what you think. But these mitochondria, I'm telling you, our energy producers of our body are huge. And if you take care of them, you can prevent some of the serious diseases that we have as a modern society, in particular the blood sugar. Big issue here. And a lot of our chronic diseases as we age and our wear and tear on our body. The mitochondria are part of the fountain of youth. If you keep them healthy, you're going to be going well into your hundreds. So take a look at those guys. Take a look at my resources. Give me some comments. Let me know what you think. Try it out. And I'd love to hear how you do. All right. This has been another episode of The Health Fix. I'm your host, Dr. Janine Krause. Thanks for listening. Thanks for tuning in to The Health Fix, the podcast all about taking control of your health, rebelling against aging, and having fun every day. A lot of patients ask me, do you think I'm aging too fast? So, I created an evaluation checklist for you to see for yourself. Plus, I created a resource guide to help you slow down the aging process right now. You can find it for free on my website, drjkrausend.com. If you like this podcast, help get the word out to others by liking it and rating it. If you'd like more natural health tips and want to join our Facebook community where I interact daily, click on the Join Group button on our website at drjkrausend.com.